In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Lermontov. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is one of the least aggressive of the Russian line from Noodlers. There is some tone variation by nib, but only if the nib difference is extreme, like a double broad. This does shade especially well for an ink that's this permanent. All in all, I'm very impressed and happy with what I'm seeing, and I can say it is one that people should be willing to give a try. It was very enjoyable to use, and I wouldn't mind using up an entire bottle of this. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Retro 51 Tornado with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we have a nice mid-tone blue with no feathering, no spread. It shades fairly well, pretty well I really want to say, considering. I really like what I'm seeing. I think the tone is not just blue, but there is some vibrancy to what I'm seeing here, making it nice. I know I say nice a lot. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone as the fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade even better than the fine did. It did really well. Now, I think it also tends to run just a little bit wetter as a pen, giving it more ability to shade, because especially we see it at the end of words where it starts getting darker. Looking at the double broad, it is darker, but if you just look at the tone itself, it's only, it's a fair bit darker, but not tons darker than it was with the medium or the fine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade just as well, and I think it's showing up a little bit better, because when this shades, it becomes incredibly dark in the shaded areas. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it did get deep into the paper with the broad, not bad with the medium or the fine, nothing bled through, touched the page underneath. Ghosting, we could write on the back of this page without any kind of a problem. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pelikan M120 Idyllic Blue with a fine nib, a Pelikan P200 with a medium nib, a Pelikan M205 the Duo Highlighter with a double broad nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get the same tone as we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get shading, and as has happened a couple times recently, I think a little bit more shading than we had on the Clairfontaine. So we're finding some real inks that are absolute winners on this paper not made for fountain pens. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine on this paper, the same tone as on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get some nice bits of shading. Not tons, and actually not as much as we had on the Clairfontaine, but we're still getting some decent shading throughout. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the medium or the fine. Just a tad bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade, just not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it is shading very well, especially considering. Now, with that, only the fine shaded better on this paper than on the Clairfontaine. I still think this paper is doing good. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine, and in fact, it's over being a blue, it's actually looking more kind of like a blue-black here, even though it's a bit lighter. The tone itself is just making me think blue-black over blue. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not really shading. The tone change that's going on is, once again, a result of the more absorbent paper and slight tone of the paper. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone as the fine. We get no feather, no spread, minor spots of shading. You can see it in the RK of work, the H of his, both a bit darker. In retirement, the dot of the I and the M look a little bit darker. And in prime, it starts lighter and works its way just a little darker. Looking at the stub nib, we get a tad bit darker than we had with the medium or the fine. A lot lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering. Fairly regular, fairly tiny. Look at the word crippled and you'll see the jagged edges of especially the LED at the end. There's no spread, no shading. Overall, it doesn't look bad in its performance here. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get very minor ghosting. The ink did get deeper into the page, but nothing came through and bled to the other side. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get a lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get a little bit of shading at the end of some of the words, like the R in pour is a bit darker. The T in not is a little bit darker. Hey, look at that T. It's got a little bit of feathers on it on the bottom edge. Sorry, there actually is a little bit of feathering. Looking at the medium nib, we get right about the same tone that we had with the fine. We do get feathering. Look at on the first line, the word white, the dot in the I, the TE on his, the IS, you see it? You see it on the H as well. There's some feathering going on here. This tone is lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine itself. There's no spread. There's a few moments that are a little bit darker, but I don't know that I'd call it shading. Looking at the double broad, it is just a little bit darker than we had with the fine or the medium on this paper, quite a bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, obviously, on the he was still allowed to, yeah, it's there the whole way through. It's just a bit more of an aggressive ink and can do that. There's no real spread. There's no shading going on whatsoever. It's not looking blue, it's looking more like it should be a blue-black. Looking at the back of the page, you see a lot of ghosting, so you can't write on the back of this page, but none of this bled through and touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman's number 4. Here is Ackerman Dutchmaster number 11. Here is Birmingham Pen Company's USS Requin Navy Blue. Here is Califolio Olanga. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get a lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does have a little bit of feathering, a little more than the last paper, but really not very much. It's fairly understandable what's going on there. We do get a little bit of spread. Again, not horrible. It is understandable what's going on there because of this paper. We do get some darker spotting occurs. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say it's shading a lot to give it that credit, but let's remember that shading on this paper is not good. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine on this paper. We do get some feathering, we do get some spread, we do get a lot of spots of shading, which are going to go ahead and set off alarms, bells, whistles, flashing red lights, all of that saying, you know this can't end well. Looking at the double broad nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium or the fine on this paper. It is quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather. It does spread. It does not shade. I wish I could say that it was, because I've seen the back of the page. It's not shading, but it's really bad news. Looking at the next page, you see that it is completely covered in pencil with me circling tons of stuff because all it did was bleed, and you can see why with the extreme amount of show-through going on because it all bled. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Caran d'Ache, their Chromatics Divine Pink. Here is an orange ink by Caran d'Ache, their Chromatics Electric Orange. Here is a magenta ink by Colorverse, their Season 1 Einstein Ring. Here is a yellow ink by Diatramentis, their Mahatma Gandhi or Saffron. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, it is a little darker than we had with the Clairfontaine, just a tad bit darker, but it's not a darker of the same blue, it's a darker of the blue-black look that this ink is giving on these non-fountain pen papers. Now, it does feather, which we expect and isn't the end of the world. It does spread a little bit, I think the spread is eating most of the feathers that are there. The feathers are very tiny. The spread is more. It's not shading. Looking at the medium nib, we get right about the same tone as the fine on this paper. Still lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still not the same color. Coming across more like a blue-black. It does feather. It does spread. It does not shade. I don't like the look of this ink when it's this way. I really like it as a blue. Looking at the double broad nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the medium or the fine on this paper. It is a little bit lighter in intensity, as in like how dark the color is. It's a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, though obviously a totally different color than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't look like it would be the same ink. It does feather. It does spread, both of them quite a bit. It does not shade at all. Looking at the back of the page, if each of these circles was a mine, this would be a very dangerous field. Now, looking at the back of the page, you completely understand why, because it does nothing but ghosting and bleeding. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Only because it is so permanent do I think a medium flow fine or medium nib will do its best. Now, wetter and broader can make it look a bit too dark and not as nice. And I think the biggest thing to be seen from this review is it's not just about the nib in this case. It is also a great deal about the paper. If you want it to be blue, then there's a few papers you should avoid. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.